The 12th of April, 1943. Paris was shrouded in the darkness of occupation as German forces had fully seized control of France. In the capital and other cities, underground groups began to take action, determined to dismantle the Nazi regime and restore peace to their homeland. One of these groups was the French resistance. But this story is not about those who fought openly with weapons. It's about those who used stealth and intellectual warfare to battle the enemy. French women in the resistance played a pivotal role. Unlike men, many of whom preferred to fight openly, women employed different methods of resistance. They were able to remain unnoticed, and the occupiers didn't suspect them of defying the regime. Women worked as couriers, carrying vital information, and used ciphers and secret codes to transmit messages that saved the lives of hundreds. One such woman, Agnes, was an ordinary schoolteacher in Paris before the war. When the Nazis seized the city, she joined one of the underground movements. In an occupied city, where all communications were under strict control by the German authorities, the ability to transmit messages in secret became crucial. One of the most common ways of sending secret messages was through what became known as living codes. These codes were not written anywhere and could easily be forgotten or destroyed if necessary. For example, women would exchange simple gestures, phrases, or even words that appeared meaningless on the surface. A simple exchange between familiar people or a facial expression could be a signal for others in the resistance network. For German soldiers stationed across the territory, it was difficult to track such signals. Women could exchange codes right under their noses without being noticed. For instance, the phrase, "What a lovely day for a walk," could mean that a meeting with other resistance members was imminent. These codes were made up on the fly, making it harder for the enemy to decrypt them. Using living codes was not only effective, but also a matter of survival. No trace was left, and if the Germans tried to uncover the messages, they would likely find nothing. But this also carried great risks because the smallest mistake could lead to the exposure of the entire network. Thus, women in the resistance, like Agnes, displayed incredible ingenuity and courage, finding ways to fight the enemy without falling into his trap. Every move they made was carefully calculated and important in the collective effort to expel the Nazis from France. As we move to the second chapter, we will see how these methods of resistance became more widespread among women in occupied Paris. The 14th of May, 1943. Paris remained under the strict control of the German occupation forces. Yet despite the repression and threats, the resistance continued to fight, hidden in the shadows, using every possible method to transmit vital information. Women, who played an essential role in this movement, continued to develop new techniques to evade enemy control. Codes and ciphers became a lifeline for maintaining secrecy. Developing encryption methods and codes became a true art form. Due to the high risk of exposure, many women, like Agnes, relied on various forms of encoding to secure their messages. Ciphers were created from simple, everyday texts, letters, or even books, but with altered word order. For example, in a letter Agnes wrote to her brother, crucial details about the next operation could be hidden. She and her allies developed a system where every word in the letter corresponded to numbers, letters, or other key symbols. For instance, if a word in the letter began with the letter C, it could represent the number 3. If a word appeared in a particular form, it might indicate the beginning of a specific operation or meeting. These messages could not be understood without knowing the key. To decrypt the text, one had to know which letters or words signified which events. To the enemy, without this knowledge, the message would make no sense. For the resistance members, however, these codes were an essential lifeline, keeping them connected and informed. But the complexity of such methods also made them vulnerable. Any loss of the key, any misunderstanding in transmission, could lead to the exposure of the entire operation. Despite these risks, Women, like Agnes, continued to work with this system, inventing new ways to protect their communications. Some even used simple pictures or drawings to convey coordinates, while others intuitively developed graphs that only those who understood their meaning could decode. Additionally, another method employed was the use of hidden messages. Using the traffic that was otherwise overlooked, they began embedding coded messages into regular announcements, newspapers, or even advertisements. For example, a poster advertising great summer resorts could carry information about the next operation. This was one of the most difficult forms of message delivery because the enemy was particularly vigilant in searching for such hidden communications. But women in the resistance had become so skilled in concealing information that even if the enemy were on alert, they still managed to send their messages. For experts in codes and encryption, such as Agnes, the stakes were high. They knew that even the smallest mistake could lead to the failure of the entire network. But, despite the risks, they kept pushing forward, continuing to refine their methods, perfecting the art of secret communication. Every piece of information they transmitted was a step toward victory, and they couldn't afford to be careless. In the next chapter, we will see how these methods of transmission became even more inventive and how women in the resistance continued to evolve their techniques in the face of mounting dangers. The 28th of June, 1943. Paris remained firmly under Nazi control, but the resistance was growing more organized. For women, playing a critical role in this movement, the risks were greater than ever. Every day brought new challenges as Nazi forces tightened their grip on the city. Yet, despite the increasing repression, these women found innovative ways to communicate and relay vital information, often right under the noses of the enemy. One of the most dangerous methods employed by the women of the resistance was the use of casual conversations. These were risky but incredibly effective ways to pass on messages. Several women working in the same place might meet under normal circumstances, exchange seemingly innocent phrases or even random remarks, which to an untrained ear would mean nothing. But for those in the resistance, they carried crucial information. For example, one woman might casually comment, "The weather is so unpredictable today, isn't it?" to indicate that the planned operation would be postponed until the following day. Or a phrase like, "I had such an interesting conversation at the market, such funny people there," could signal to other members of the group that they needed to prepare for an upcoming meeting. These conversations were never meant to raise suspicion. To outsiders, they appeared as simple, everyday exchanges. But to those in the know, these words carried life-saving messages. For women like Agnes, even the smallest details were important. They had learned how to deliver these coded messages seamlessly so they wouldn't be detected. These exchanges could take place while shopping in the market or while walking along the street. Even a single glance or a subtle gesture could hold a hidden meaning, offering a signal for others involved in the network. The complexity of these methods lay in their invisibility. To passers-by, these were just ordinary conversations, but for members of the resistance, each moment was carefully calculated to avoid detection. A single slip-up, an unintended gesture, could be disastrous. At the same time, they also began using body language and facial expressions to communicate, especially if other people were around. For example, a specific look or a slight movement of the hand at the right moment could signal an urgent message. These tactics required a high level of training and coordination because any mistake could expose the entire operation. The most remarkable part of these strategies was that, even though they were so simple, they were also incredibly effective. The women in the resistance were able to communicate secretly in plain sight, making it almost impossible for the enemy to detect. Yet, this method of communication was a high-risk strategy, as any mistake could lead to a catastrophic failure of the mission. In the next chapter, we will see how the pressure of increasing repression forced the women of the resistance to develop even more complex methods of encryption and message transmission. The 15th of September, 1943. In the midst of escalating Nazi repression, life for the women involved in the resistance had become even more perilous. The German forces were tightening their control over the occupied territories, with more patrols on the streets and stricter checks on postal services and radio transmissions. These conditions made it increasingly difficult for the resistance to maintain secret communication. But despite the growing risks, the women of the resistance continued to find creative ways to pass on vital information. One of the most innovative methods they developed at this time was the use of signs and symbols. To avoid drawing suspicion, women began to transmit messages through ordinary yet seemingly insignificant objects such as clothing, the shape of a hat, hand gestures, or even the type of shoes they wore. These small details, which might appear inconspicuous to the untrained eye, carried critical meaning for members of the resistance. A simple change in the color of a scarf or a slight alteration in how someone wore their jacket could signal a shift in the schedule or route of an operation. For example, a woman passing a certain building and adjusting her hat in a particular way might indicate that an important meeting was about to take place. These signs, often drawn from everyday life, were understood only by those who had been trained to recognize them. To the enemy, they were meaningless. Agnes and her fellow resistance members understood the power of these subtle symbols. They knew that they had to be inconspicuous, yet precise. For instance, they could leave hidden markings in newspapers, advertisements, or even in the folds of paper. These small, almost invisible details were enough to alert a fellow resistance member to an upcoming action or meeting. They also used architectural features of the city to encode messages. The placement of certain street signs, the design of a building, or even the layout of an advertisement could become part of the resistance's secret code. If a woman passed by a building and made a small gesture or touched a particular spot on the wall, this could indicate something vital to her fellow resistance members. This technique allowed them to keep their communications secret, even when surrounded by crowds. Animals also played a role in this clandestine system. Birds, cats, and even dogs were used as part of the transmission process. A bird flying from one spot to another or a dog barking at a certain time could be the sign for an upcoming event. By incorporating animals into their system, the women in the resistance further enhanced the secrecy of their communications. In a world where even the smallest slip-up could lead to exposure, the women of the resistance had to be incredibly resourceful. They relied on everything from flowers arranged in a certain way to subtle hand movements to convey critical information. Every detail mattered. And, despite the ever-present danger, they managed to communicate in ways that the enemy could never hope to understand. In the next chapter, we'll see how the growing pressure from the Nazis forced the women of the resistance to face even more difficult challenges and threats. The 19th of October, 1943. Paris continued to be under strict Nazi control, but life for the women in the resistance had become increasingly treacherous. The more successful their operations became, the more inventive the enemy became in their attempts to capture and dismantle the resistance network. Nazi forces used a variety of methods to track down those who defied them. And, among the most dangerous tactics, was the use of traps. These traps, which often involved misleading or deceiving individuals into revealing their secrets, posed a deadly risk for anyone caught in them. One evening, during a night operation, Agnes and her fellow resistance members found themselves in a perilous situation. They had been transmitting information about a meeting, using the usual methods, casual phrases, coded exchanges in everyday conversation when, for reasons unknown, their actions began to draw the attention of a German patrol. At first, nothing seemed amiss, but before long, the women found themselves in the midst of a trap. The enemy, always vigilant, had learned to recognize even the smallest signs of suspicion. What seemed like an innocent exchange of words between colleagues quickly raised alarm. One of the women accidentally reacted to a seemingly harmless gesture, which drew attention. This was a trap. The Nazis detained the woman who was carrying vital information at that moment. She had planned to pass on a crucial message, but now she found herself face to face with the enemy. They tried to extract information by any means possible. In situations like these, every movement, every word could make the difference between survival and betrayal. Despite the danger, the women of the resistance remained calm. They had been trained to withstand pressure and deception. In the face of such a threat, it was not just the messages that mattered, but also how they carried themselves. A single slip-up could lead to disaster, but one of their key tactics was distraction, using small but effective methods to mislead their captors. With this strategy, the woman was able to escape the trap, though the cost was high. This encounter demonstrated how high the stakes were for the members of the resistance. A single mistake or an unintended reaction could unravel months of preparation. The Nazis, growing more adept at their methods of torture and interrogation, used psychological pressure to break down those they captured. They learned to apply even more sophisticated techniques to force confessions. But despite the increasing danger, the women of the resistance were resolute. They knew that even in the face of such extreme risk, they had to press on. They continued to employ their most creative and dangerous methods of communication. The slightest mistake could bring everything to an end, but still, they fought on, using every trick at their disposal to avoid detection. In the next chapter, we will see how the escalating pressures and risks forced the women of the resistance to adopt even more complex encryption techniques and become even more careful in their operations. The 3rd of December 1943. Occupied Paris continued to be a city of fear, where the tension of everyday life was accompanied by the constant threat of betrayal and capture. For the women in the resistance, the stakes were growing higher with each passing day. After the betrayal of one of their trusted members, many resistance cells began to realize just how vulnerable they had become. Trust was now in short supply, and their carefully devised methods of communication were no longer as secure as they had once been. The discovery of the traitor rocked Agnes and her comrades to their core. The person who had been working alongside them, whom they had once trusted, had become a source of information for the Germans. It was an incredibly hard pill to swallow. Someone from within their own ranks had exposed their secrets. This realization shook the very foundation of the resistance network. With this betrayal, every operation, every encrypted message became suspect. The codes that once seemed impenetrable now felt fragile. Agnes and her colleagues knew that even the most subtle symbols, the most innocuous-looking exchanges, might now be compromised. There was no way to know for certain who could still be trusted. For a time, the group was paralyzed by the weight of this betrayal. The complexity of the codes, the careful planning, they now seemed irrelevant if the enemy had a mole within their ranks. Yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, Agnes knew that they couldn't give up. They had come too far, and there were too many people relying on them. To stop now would mean that the sacrifices already made were in vain. Agnes began to realize that they had to adapt to this new reality. There would be no more trusting everyone, no more simple solutions. They needed to become even more secretive, more cautious. But most importantly, they needed to rebuild the trust within the group. The betrayal had shattered their illusions, but it had also made them stronger and more aware of the dangers they faced. In response to the increased risk of infiltration, Agnes and her comrades began to develop new methods of communication, ones that were even more complex and difficult to decipher. The once simple codes were now layered with additional encryption, making them harder to crack. Even more attention was paid to ensuring that every message was properly transmitted and received. without leaving any trace behind. Every member of the resistance understood that their survival depended on their ability to stay one step ahead of the enemy. The realization of the betrayal made the women of the resistance more determined than ever to fight. They knew that the stakes were higher than ever before, and that they could no longer afford to be careless. Their resolve was stronger, but the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. In the next chapter, we will see how, despite the mounting risks and the pressure to survive, Agnes and her comrades continue to fight back against the enemy with renewed determination. The 27th of January, 1944. Occupied Paris continued to live under the oppressive shadow of Nazi control, and the women of the resistance found themselves facing increasingly difficult decisions. After the betrayal, everything had changed. Trust was a rare commodity, and their once clever methods of encryption and secret communication were now at risk. The enemy had grown more adept at tracking and intercepting messages. The women of the resistance were no longer operating in the shadows as they once had, but rather under the constant threat of exposure. Agnes and her comrades knew that the time had come to make a choice: to continue the fight, despite the heightened danger, or to disappear and save themselves. It was a decision that weighed heavily on them all. The risks were greater than ever, and with every passing day, it seemed that the noose around them was tightening. Each operation, every hidden meeting, could be their last. But for Agnes and many others, giving up was not an option. For months, they had worked tirelessly, passing information, sabotaging Nazi operations, and taking whatever steps were necessary to ensure the resistance survived. But the growing threat of discovery was becoming too great. Agnes, who had always been a symbol of resilience and strength, found herself questioning how much more she could endure. Her heart was heavy with the weight of the decision. Could she continue, knowing that any mistake could lead to death not only for her, but for everyone she worked with? Yet, in her mind, there was no other choice. She could not abandon the cause. Too many lives had been touched by their actions. Too many people depended on them. Her commitment to the resistance, to the idea of a free France, could not be extinguished by fear. The group, despite their fears, made the collective decision to keep going. They would continue to fight, to pass their coded messages, and to carry out operations with even greater caution. But now, more than ever, they would have to be vigilant, knowing that the smallest mistake could unravel everything they had worked for. The women of the resistance knew that they were not just fighting for their lives, but for the future of their country. The pressure was mounting. The Nazi forces were becoming increasingly aggressive in their attempts to break the resistance. Every operation was more dangerous than the last, and every moment spent in the open brought them closer to discovery. But Agnes knew, deep down, that the resistance's fight was more than just about survival. It was about something much greater: freedom, justice, and the hope for a better future. In the next chapter, we will see how Agnes and her comrades take one final, decisive step in their battle against the enemy, knowing that their actions will have profound consequences. The 12th of March, 1944. The resistance in Paris had reached a critical moment. The Nazis were tightening their control, and the women of the resistance knew that their next move could be their last. For Agnes and her comrades, this was the culmination of months of risk, deception, and resilience. Their work had already dealt significant blows to the Nazi war machine, but now they had to take the final step, to strike a decisive blow that would disrupt the enemy's plans and further weaken their hold on France. The day of the operation began like any other. The streets of Paris were bustling with the usual mix of occupied civilians and German soldiers. No one could tell that beneath the surface, a group of women were preparing for a mission that would alter the course of their struggle. It was to be a moment of reckoning, one that would either succeed or end in disaster. But no matter the outcome, Agnes and her comrades were determined to follow through. They had come too far to turn back now. For weeks, they had been preparing for this operation, using all the tricks of their trade, hidden codes, subtle messages, and seemingly innocent gestures to plan the attack. The goal was simple: to destroy one of the key communication lines that the Germans were using to move supplies and troops throughout occupied France. By cutting this critical artery, they would create confusion, delay Nazi plans, and provide the resistance with a much-needed advantage. The operation itself was a success, executed with the precision and stealth that had become the hallmark of the women in the resistance. But, as expected, the Nazis soon began to retaliate. They launched a series of arrests, stepping up their efforts to root out anyone connected to the resistance. Agnes and her comrades knew that they had struck a blow, but they also understood that the enemy would now be more determined than ever to find them. The risks of their actions had never been clearer. As they carried out their mission, they knew that their survival depended on the secrecy and effectiveness of their efforts. The slightest slip-up, the smallest error, could expose them and lead to the ruin of everything they had worked for. Yet, in the face of this uncertainty, they pressed on, knowing that they had made a difference. Their actions had disrupted the Nazi war effort and had brought them one step closer to their ultimate goal of freeing France from occupation. Agnes, like many of her comrades, understood that the price of freedom was high. Each step they took toward victory was fraught with danger, and they had sacrificed everything for the cause. But in that moment, as they watched their operation unfold successfully, they knew that their struggle had not been in vain. In the end, the women of the resistance had proven that even in the darkest of times, when everything seemed hopeless, there was always a way to fight back. They had used their ingenuity, their courage, and their determination to stand against the enemy, and in doing so, they had played a crucial role in the eventual liberation of France.